Hi, everyone. I'm Ophelia, and I grew up in Maryland, a serene state, with long rows of homes and streets lined with trees. I grew up there with my parents for the most part. From the moment she made breakfast in the morning until dusk in the tiny kitchen she cherished, my mother was a kind woman who never failed to smile at me. My father was a quiet but responsible man who always put in a lot of effort to support the family. The family lived in a modest, unadorned home that was filled with affection. I believed that everything in my memory was flawless. However, my world abruptly fell apart when I was just 15 years old. After a brief and unexpected illness, my mother went away so fast that I was unaware of what was going on. As I watched my father grow lonely in a home that used to be full of laughing, the sense of emptiness intensified. We were no longer the family we had been, yet we still lived. I went to school every morning and returned home every evening. My mother was gone, but the kitchen and the straightforward meals remained the same. Even though there were only two of us at every meal, my father and I seemed to be wider apart than the entire house. My father then got married again when I was 18. I knew deep down that he deserved to be happy again, yet it still came as a shock. My stepmother, his new wife, was a nice and gentle person. Lucien, her son, was a year younger than me, and she brought him along. It seemed weird at first, like my life had been completely upended once more. The tranquility I had experienced had vanished. However, my world abruptly fell apart when I was just 15 years old. After a brief and unexpected illness, my mother went away so fast that I was unaware of what was going on. As I watched my father grow lonely in a home that used to be full of laughing, the sense of emptiness intensified. We were no longer the family we had been, yet we still lived. I went to school every morning and returned home every evening. My mother was gone, but the kitchen and the straightforward meals remained the same. Even though there were only two of us at every meal, my father and I seemed to be wider apart than the entire house. Even though this new younger brother had never done anything to make me feel uncomfortable, at first I always felt uncomfortable trying to fit in. He was silent, and maybe like me, he was getting used to the new circumstances. The family would congregate in the living room in the evenings. Below, Dad and stepmother sat talking about their jobs and future ambitions. I instantly lowered my head as Lucien and I exchanged a glance of mild bewilderment. Family dinners were the same, and over time they evolved into a peculiar opportunity for us to learn more about one another. I often felt a little out of the ordinary when Lucien would pick up food for me. He rarely spoke and was always silent, but occasionally he looked at me more intently than normal. I pondered whether it was a younger brother's sentiments for his new older sister or whether I was being overly sensitive. However, as time went on, it became evident that there was a hidden conflict between us that neither of us discussed. It was getting harder to tell which sentiments were sisterly, even if they should have been. Throughout the day, there were times when I felt my heart race when Lucien was around, and I detested the sensation and the fact that I had started to see him as more than simply a brother. I once heard faint footsteps in the hallway late at night. Lucien entered my room covertly. We would talk for a few minutes as usual before he went back to his room, but this time he sat for a longer period of time, his eyes searching me intently, as though he wanted to say something. I felt the atmosphere between us become oddly stuffy, but I wasn't sure how to respond.
Prosody.
I was perplexed as the stillness continued, and before I could think much more, I gave him a small nod to ask him to stay a little while longer. Two strangers who were connected in a way that no one could describe sat there together in the dim light and darkness. To tell the truth, I really loved Lucien. There were moments when I couldn't help but notice how attractive my brother was. Given that Lucien was actually my brother in name, I questioned whether I should feel bad about it. However, those ideas were frequently short-lived and disregarded for more sensible reasons, such as the intimacy of sharing a home or the harmony of two young people in a small area. Unlike my father and stepmother, who slept on the first level, we slept in separate but adjacent rooms on the second story. This occasionally led to unpleasant situations. Both Lucien and I were in a pivotal period in our lives. He was a senior in high school, and busy getting ready for important tests, while I was a freshman in college. The tension between us was evident, even though we were both attempting to adjust to the new routine of life. On other evenings after school, we sat on the living room sofa with the TV lights softly gleaming, but neither of us spoke because we were at a loss for words. My feelings toward Lucien were vague and not at all like those of typical siblings. I came to see that my feelings for him went beyond familial affection. I couldn't explain the sensation, but I couldn't help but notice that my heart raced whenever I saw Lucien. When we unintentionally crossed paths on the stairs, I couldn't help but see something in his gaze. Like any other evening, it was quiet, but maybe I knew it wouldn't end that way. Lucien and I were left alone at home for roughly 5 days while my parents were away on vacation. We initially just assumed it would be a chance to unwind without parental supervision. We turned on a romantic movie and sat together in the living room that evening. We were both seeking for a way to pass the time and weren't particularly interested in the movie. In order to unwind after a hectic week, I made some dried squid, fruit, and a couple beer cans. The film got off to a rather simple start. The silence of the home was filled with light laughs and short talk as we sat about talking as usual. However, the film suddenly cut to an unexpected scene in which a couple embraces passionately. I'm not sure why, but we both stopped talking. Laughter and casual chat had stopped. The ease of two sisters spending a peaceful moment together abruptly vanished from the room between Lucien and me. Lucien's eyes were on me, but they weren't looking at me normally. My body started to feel hot, but I chose to remain silent and sit there with the beer can in my hand to maintain my composure. But Lucien had embraced me before I could comprehend what was going on. His moves were powerful, surprising, and unstoppable. His kisses were intense, as though all of the long-suppressed feelings had now burst forth. I was powerless to resist. Even though my heart was racing, my body had a different reaction. Right then, in the quiet chamber in the darkness, we had gone beyond the bounds of sisterly love. It was no longer a typical evening. It was a significant turning moment, and I knew that things would never be the same after that, that every limit was crossed. I couldn't deny that I had allowed my feelings to rule my actions and caused unwarranted events. Lucien and I spent the entire night together, going beyond all limits. We said very little. According to what had been repressed for so long, everything appeared to occur naturally. The intimacy we had attempted to preserve was no longer there, supplanted by feelings beyond our control. I vividly recall how I felt the next morning. I slept beside Lucien in the room that should have been my own quiet sleeping space, the soft sunlight filtering through the curtains. The room was silent, and everything was the same as it had been every other day. Even if the light was warm, something had totally changed inside of me. For a little period, we simply stared at one another without saying anything, and maybe both of us realized that our lives would never be the same after this. We proceeded to take advantage of the fact that my father and stepmother were still traveling a great distance in the days that followed. The feeling of unease had vanished, replaced by a paradoxical sense of comfort. Without the prying eyes of others, we lived as though we were two people in love. Meals were now private times between Lucien and myself rather than family gatherings. We sat together every night, watched movies, spoke, and then went to bed together. I allowed myself to lose sight of reality during those days, forgetting that Lucien and I were merely a nameless sister. During that period, we lived as though we were a carefree, youthful couple. I was unable to resist or avoid the sensation of getting carried away by our long nights together and our hidden love because everything happened so effortlessly and organically. And then my folks came back one day. Everything was back to normal once they were inside the house. I went back to being two sisters living together with Lucien. We pretended that nothing had occurred, that each private moment had been a passing fantasy. My parents were unaware of it. While Lucien and I sat there, silently exchanging glances, knowing that our secret would have to be kept forever, they continued to smile and talk about their adventures. We kept seeing each other in the months that followed, maintaining our covert friendship. The long, restless nights and the cunning times became second nature. Lucien would sneak into my room whenever my parents had to leave or go to bed early, and we would cling to each other as though nothing had ever separated us. We attempted to be normal during the day. Family dinners went on as usual. Lucian and I just looked at one another, and my folks didn't suspect anything. I felt out of breath from this underlying stress, but I was unable to stop. Even though my remorse was gradually getting to me, it wasn't enough to convince me to give up. I was still living in secret. I worried that I wouldn't be able to get away from Lucian because every night and every moment grew so familiar. I began taking birth control pills discreetly and carefully because I knew I couldn't allow this to continue. Despite my dread of the relationship's repercussions, I decided to manage it rather than end it. I made an effort to persuade myself that we would never be found and that everything was still accessible. Lucian graduated and enrolled in college around a year later. In order to further his studies, he had to relocate to a different place and abandon his hometown. Despite my reluctance to acknowledge it, I knew that our relationship would change after Lucian went. It was more difficult because of the distance between us. No more secret meetings, no more time spent in silence. Despite my strong longing for the past, the distance compelled us to put our connection on wait. I made the decision to start over after I graduated. I applied to work for a digital company as an office worker. Although the job wasn't particularly noteworthy, it provided me with stability and a reprieve from the days of strife and emotional upheaval. I met the man who would forever alter my life at that point. He is a calm, self-assured, and endearing man who owns a sizable hair salon in the city. His power and gentleness impressed me from the first time we met. I had never met anyone like him before. I had never felt safe in all these years, but every story he told me and every glance he gave me that feeling. We fell in love right away. Everything unfolded organically, as though our paths were meant to cross. Soon after, we were married and began creating the family life I had always envisioned. Our lives are more full now that we are parents to a child. I can momentarily ignore the unpleasant memories of the past when I spend time with him and the child, but occasionally they still resurface when I'm feeling vulnerable. I was certain that I had discovered a man deserving of my love and respect, my new home. However, the recollection of Lucian and those covert days had not entirely vanished from my thoughts. I questioned whether I would ever really move on from it all, but protecting my family was the most important thing right now. However, I still harbored a tremendous sense of guilt toward my husband. He was a great man who always showed me true affection and concern. But each time I gazed into his eyes, I felt as though I was concealing something from him that he ought to have known about me. I'm not sure if I should tell him about Lucian and myself. I'm split between telling him everything and keeping this a secret forever. And sometimes the thought keeps me up at night. He will never look at me the same way again if I confess. I'm scared. A confession has the potential to destroy all we've created, including the small family I treasure. On the other hand, carrying this secret about with me every day feels like a burden. I feel unworthy of his love for me because of it. To be honest, I have no idea what to do. I'm at a crossroads and unsure about the best course of action. You could be critical of me after hearing my narrative because I have harmed a lot of people and made poor choices in the past. But all I can ask is, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Knowing that telling the truth could destroy everything, would you still choose to do so? Or would you want to remain silent and let the past to ingrain itself deeply in your mind in the hopes that it won't ever resurface to harm the people you care about? Please share your thoughts in the space provided for comments below. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Should I keep this a secret to preserve what I have, or should I come clean and suffer the consequences? I'm genuinely at a crossroads and don't know which way is right. Therefore, I appreciate any guidance, pity, or criticism.